fact, Northern Virginia is considered the data center capital of the world with a higher concentration of data centers than anywhere else. And there's concern that this can create potential issues when it comes to the region's power grid. And when a power line reportedly went down just last week, the grid needed several minutes to recover because of the number of data centers that have been drawing power. So joining us now to explain this a little bit more and talk about what should happen next in a situation like this is Alan Cooper, CEO and co-founder of On.Energy. Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And first, we just mentioned this power incident. What do we know about this? We know this caused a lot of data centers to go off the grid all at once. What are you hearing about this?
Yeah, essentially what happened was there was a transmission failure on the grid and a group of data centers disconnected to protect themselves. You have to think of data centers like a large electric load of any kind, right? They're trying to protect these very expensive assets that have been built. And when there's volatility on the grid, there's almost like a breaker that goes off that tries to disconnect to protect. And this is very similar to what happens at people's homes and people's flat screen TVs. Really the problem with data centers isn't with data centers coming online. Really, the issue is when data centers come offline suddenly. The reality is the impacts of this event were rather modest. It caused flickers on the grid, which is like a literal flicker at your home or at a factory, at an industrial facility. And so rather little impact. But it is indicative of what could happen as these data centers come online and become larger and exposed to the grid if things are not built in a way that is responsible, which largely is the way things are being built into the future now.
And I want to talk about what that responsible building looks like to you in a moment. But, you know, as you mentioned there, this wasn't a blackout, but there were the flickers. The region felt this. How dangerous could a situation like this be, Alan?
It depends on the size and magnitude of that volatility. I mean, grid operators work extremely hard to keep the grid stable. And I think we need to give them a lot of credit to how they're analyzing projects before they come online, the immense effort that PJM and local grid operators and utilities, the amount of energy and effort that and technology that they apply to keep the lights on all the time. I think as things become more severe and these sites become larger, it becomes more complex, but they're applying massive investment and technology to make sure that grid reliability stays at a very high standard in the US, which it always has been.
And you mentioned the way, you know, data centers are meant to respond in a situation or scenario like this. Is that what prevented a blackout in this case? That, like you said, the data centers shut off in response?
No, it actually, so data centers shutting off could actually exacerbate the problem, right? So it's what happens is the grid is kind of being held in balance between supply and demand. In that imbalance, it causes volatility. And when the grid feels that volatility, an electrical system will try to seek to protect itself, which could make the problem worse. And so that's really like the nightmare scenario, that it could cause sort of like a rolling blackout scenario. It's very important to note that data centers are applying billions of dollars of investment, including into technologies like the ones that we deploy, to make data centers grid safe and exactly applying technologies to modern data centers, especially large ones for AI training, anything over 75 megawatts today, with increasing levels of rigor for interconnection that would protect the grid and all of the consumers in them. And this is all a massive opportunity for data centers to not only become a user of electricity, but really a valuable contributor to the grid in what is really the largest build out of infrastructure in human history. And it's happening right here in our backyard. And I think we need to really look at this like a huge opportunity.
And you mentioned that responsible infrastructure, and we know this is very, very complicated, Alan. You work in this space every day, but in super layman's terms, what can be done to make sure the grid stays reliable when there is an issue like we saw the other day?
Yeah, so essentially, solutions like the one that we provide at On, it could make the grid safe. Essentially, what we provide is like a firewall between the grid and the data center. So it makes the data center consume perfect quality power all the time without feeling any of the volatility that's happening on the grid. And it basically hides the data center from the grid so it doesn't feel any of its volatility either. And in that case, for a situation like the one that happened not too long ago, it could have completely isolated the problem, kept the data centers fully online, and we're building on multiple campuses for hyperscalers and data center developers implementing this technology exactly with this problem in mind.
We know these data centers, they are not going away. The headquarters of all of this development is where we are. In your work, what is the future of the power grid, Alan?
I think the future of the power grid is increasingly connected and flexible. We've been deploying batteries onto the grid for more than 10 years across 6 different countries. And that's very clearly the future. I think, again, data centers are building massive power infrastructure for themselves, which they're consuming. And I think that is often viewed as a problem and all the obstacles that could cause, and too seldom looked at in terms of all of the value that could provide to all of the consumers of energy on the grid, all of the value that flexibility of these data centers contributing to the grid as valuable, responsible grid citizens. And I think that's what we're all about. We're about making data centers grid safe and helping the US win the AI race.
Alan Cooper, CEO and co-founder of On.Energy. A very interesting topic. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain that a little bit more for us here this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
You too, take care and stay with us. We'll be right back after this quick break.